Hello and welcome to the podcast. I'm Karen Weaver. Since Donald Trump was inaugurated as the president for the second time, many of our cherished institutions, including higher education, seem to be under attack. Many schools have been or are being singled out for government interference and oversight. Schools like UCLA, Duke, Harvard, Northwestern, Virginia, and others are wondering if they will be next. Last month, Trump turned his focus to college athletics. As part of a White House press conference announcing the reinstatement of the President's Council on Physical Fitness, Trump took a detour to denounce the state of college athletics. A week or so earlier, he issued an executive order directing many federal departments and agencies to come up with a plan to fix college sports. As I and others have been trying to digest what all of this means, I reached out to Bloomberg Media contributor Jeanne Sheehan Zaino to help us sort this out. Jeanne is a senior democracy fellow at the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. She is also an award-winning professor of political science and international studies at Iona University in New York. Jeanne, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me, Karen. I'm so happy to be here.
What a time to be here. So we're going to start off with the commentary that the president provided from the podium in the White House last week that talks a little bit about his view of the state of confusion in college athletics.
On college football, in terms of what happened, it's a mess. What happened? That's what they're doing with college football, and the fans are upset about it, and players are being taken from team after team, and being traded around like playing cards, and a lot of money's passing and nobody knows what's happening. So these people behind me are going to be very much involved in figuring that whole thing out and working on it and trying to bring some sanity to that incredible, not only the football, college sports, very, very bad for women. It's very bad what's happening, because now all of a sudden there's no women that are able to get the money that they're talking about. You know, it seems to be going mostly to football, some basketball, and women's sports are being totally decimated. We know that, Annika, you know, with this. It's all going into football, and some to basketball, and everything else is being left behind. And women are being left behind, and lesser sports are being left behind, and the Olympics is being decimated, because that was like training for the Olympics, and now we're not going to have that many of those sports left. The smaller sports, they're almost going to be completely wiped out. This is crazy what's going on. We banned men from competing in women's sports, and last week the United States Olympic and Paralympic Committee announced that they will be complying with that order.
So, Jeanne, that's a lot to digest. What is going on there with what he's trying to say is the state of play in college athletics?
Yeah, it's always a lot when we're talking about President Trump. So there's nothing new there. You know, I do see this as part and parcel of Donald Trump's broader agenda as it pertains to both colleges and universities and sports. And that's, you know, one reason I'm so delighted to talk to you, because one of the animating issues that has drawn him to his attack on universities and colleges has, of course, been sports and protecting traditional women's sports. And
Correct.
so, you know, I see this as part and parcel of a broader plan. And one thing I would just even correct my own language is Donald Trump is the vessel for this. He is the one who has put this on the agenda in this concerted way. But he is standing on the shoulders of the many, many conservatives who for decades have been building to this moment. And so there is, you know, a widespread understanding amongst conservatives, not just in the United States, but around the world. And one country we hear a lot about in this regard is Hungary, but there are many others, that we need to return to our traditional pastoral ways. They have been stripped from us. And in the United States, we hear about that mostly in the post-civil rights era. And so in an effort to do that, you want to return to everything that is traditional. When the president says, make America great, well, when was it great? Pre the civil rights movement. And so a lot of these attacks on universities and colleges, whether it's in the sports arena, whether it's in the humanities, which is near and dear to my heart, whether it's in the social sciences, I mean, the list goes on, are part and parcel of this larger conversation that conservatives have been having behind the scenes for a long time, and Donald Trump has brought it to the forefront.
One of the things that deeply concerns me is in the settlement of some of these accusations, I don't know what else to call them, against certain high profile universities, there seems to be this pattern of agreeing to release admissions and race data. What do you think that's about?
Yeah, I think that's one thing that's deeply troubling. I mean, I think there's a list of things for those of us who value universities and colleges. There's a list of troubling steps that have been taken. And that one, of course, is at the top of the list, any threat to academic freedom. I think that is part and parcel of the attempt to take control of international students coming to colleges and universities. And of course, they are a major source of funding because they pay full boat at colleges and universities in the United States. So I think it is part and parcel of that, because what are the president's main levers of power? It is funding. It is the fact that the public and private universities get a good deal of funding, whether through grants, whether through loans from the federal government. And so if you want to control them, one way to do that is to choke off that funding. And of course, international students bring that. Another way is to attack the tax basis, which we've heard about. Should we remove your ability not to pay property tax, for instance, to be exempt? So I think it's part and parcel of what the conservatives and now in the White House see the president see as their main sources of power to exercise control over these universities. But again, I would say it's also part and parcel of a larger plan that has been brewing for a long time, which is to raise a conservative elite in this country. And one of the arguments that, and there may be some truth to this, that conservatives have been making for a long time is these most elite of our institutions are moderate to liberal. And there's really no denying that faculty are moderate to liberal, if you just look at the sheer numbers. And so how do you raise a cultural conservative elite? You control these universities, which of course suggests a ridiculous amount of hypocrisy as it pertains to things like cutting down on anti-Semitism and the rest of the notions that they have put forward as the main reason that they are taking these steps at these colleges and universities.
Would it be fair to say that this is not just about anti-Semitism, it's about the broader issues that you're saying?
Absolutely. I think that there is no question that when you hear what they say are the major issues as to why they've taken these steps, it is to cut down on anti-Semitism. Having been like you at colleges and universities my entire professional life and spoken to so many people about this since this started, I can't think of one person I've spoken to who doesn't want to do the same. We want to address anti-Semitism in all its forms. We want to address any anti-Muslim, anti-Islam. And, we want to make these safe places and safe spaces for young people, faculty, community members to be. The idea that sure, we've all had problems at our universities with this, but this attack has gone much broader than that. Then they talk about protecting traditional women's sports. That's something that a lot of people have strong feelings about. There is a targeted way to do that, to have conversations with universities and to move forward, but that's not what we're seeing. So, when you look at what they're saying they're doing and what they're actually doing, there's just a wide gulf in between. And somebody used this example, which I think illustrates this. if you want to cut down on anti-Semitism truly on college campuses, you don't then fire 50% of the people in the civil rights office whose job is to investigate and to address these horrific problems, right? If it was really your goal, you maybe invest more in those people. You would hire more of them. So there is a hypocrisy that goes on here because, again, the goal is much broader than I think has truly been recognized on college campuses, where a lot of people, and I think there's a lot that's I will say collectively, should be our concern and all fault, haven't spent the time investigating and understanding what's been happening. And so it's really hit us in the aftermath of his second inaugural in a way. I think if we all look back now, we see it coming in a much more concerted way.
I'm really glad you explained that because I know people, lots of my colleagues and friends who work in higher education are so focused on what they need to do because there's so many pressing crises that it's hard to keep track of what he says and what he means and what he wants the Congress to do. And it seems like it's all coming at us 100 miles an hour. How do we just kind of sort through what we should be paying attention to right now?
So it's such a good question. I do a course on political risk management. And I think as it pertains to the institutions themselves, that we have collectively not done a great job in terms of ensuring that we have risk strategies in place. Because to your point, you can't guard against everything that he may do, that Congress may do, that the next president may or may not do, that the next governor, there's just so much. I mean, we all just lived through the pandemic. Who would have imagined that that would befall us? And it did. So one thing that surprises me is that our institutions in higher ed have not done a better job creating risk mitigation strategies, figuring out when we are at risk, where these minimum resources that we have, they're all limited, where they should go to combat what would be the greatest risk to our institutions. And so I think one thing that institutions like ours and other higher ed colleges and universities, they all have risk mitigation strategies. I'm not sure they have political risk mitigation strategies that are desperately needed. And of course, that starts with really understanding and taking a look at ourselves, what is most valuable to us and what is most at risk, and then doing what we can to protect it. And, with risk strategy, if the crisis hits, and just as an example, hypothetically, if the crisis is Donald Trump is elected and we have a Republican Congress and they have the power to take these steps, it's almost already too late. So you have to act in order to protect yourself prior so that you can respond. So that's one of the few things I think colleges and universities have not done well. And
Okay.
just to give you an example of that, so much of the attacks that we see on colleges and universities have been on cutting off their funding. And whether that's Columbia, whether it's Harvard, I mean, so many institutions, Penn. And I've long said that we as faculty, we as institutions, have not done a very good job in our public facing role of explaining to our communities and the public at large why we matter, why we are not just tenure faculty, not working a heck of a lot, not doing much. No, the whole
I do.
that
Yeah.
that the money that's invested, because taxpayers have a right to know, what is this money being used for? The money that's invested is being put to enormously important use, whether it's Alzheimer's research, cancer research, and AI, the list goes on and on. And that's one of the reasons that I've always had a public facing role, like my role at Bloomberg now or any media outlet I've been at, because I think we as institutions need to do a better job saying, this is what we do, this is who we are, this is where this funding is going, because it is enormous payoff for society that all of this research is being done. And I think as a political scientist, one of my biggest fears is how insecure the United States will be vis-a-vis our competitors like China if these attacks on our elite institutions of higher education continue. There is nothing that will hurt us more in our competition with China than these attacks. And, I say, and I know sometimes you watch Bloomberg, so you may hear me say, sometimes I scratch my head and wonder, is Donald Trump working for Xi Jinping? And I say that sort of, jokingly, but the reality is, if you look at what we are facing in the 21st century vis-a-vis China, and what he is doing to destroy one of the bright spots in the United States, which is higher ed, that attracts so many young people from around the world. They want to come here.
Yeah.
Xi Jinping's daughter came here. That is something we should be investing in, not attacking. And so, but I also say that we have to do a better job explaining to people why attacks on these institutions are not just attacks on elites. They are attacks on the safety and security of the United States going forward.
Yeah.
So I think there's a lot we can do, and be better organized to do. And I know you started the question by saying, where to focus. And that's my daily battle because so much is going on. But I do think it takes a concerted strategy to say you're not going to focus on everything, but that we do need leadership from our faculty at the senior levels and our institutions and people who care. So many of our alum who, they are, for them, these institutions are just one of the great bright spots of their lives. We need to work together to come up with a strategy. Because again, I do firmly also believe that taxpayers are paying money that are going to institutions in large numbers, and they have a right to understand where that's going. And we have an obligation to explain that to them and to make the case for what we're doing, because it's very important.
Could not agree more. And in fact, that was sort of the theory behind starting this podcast, was a chance to have more of a dialogue around the value and benefits, not just of higher ed, but also of college athletics, because we often talk about college athletics being the front porch of the institution. It's our most forward facing entity, if you will. And yet college athletics is in the middle of it, the most transformational change it has ever undergone, because of this idea of starting on August 1st, we are now sharing revenues with athletes at the Division I level and a couple of Division II schools, but mostly Division I. That's an entirely different model than what I went to school with, perhaps when you went to school. And you went to UConn, I think so. You had some pretty good teams there. Um, but you attracted athletes because of the quality of the education, the quality of the coaching, the schedule, those types of things. Now athletes are looking at getting revenue, getting paid. How much am I going to get there? Help my listeners understand in that context what the president's executive order might mean to upend college athletics, his statements he just made at the press conference that we shared, and also what Congress is doing right now. What are their roles in inserting this tidal wave that's overtaking college sports?
Yeah. And yes, thank you. I am a Yukon Husky. I tutored the basketball team, the women's basketball, when I was at Yukon. Yeah, I have a family of Huskies, my sisters and my parents. So yes, a very proud Yukon Husky, and of course now an Iona Gale. So
Yes, of course, yes.
sports are very close. Um, you know, one thing, so in terms of the relationship between the president and Congress, I mean, this is one of the confounding aspects of where we are, again, not just with Donald Trump, but with American government overall, is that Congress has very much ground to a halt in terms of what it is able and or willing to do. And this again goes back several years. I mean, we can't even budget on time. That's why we saw the latest reconciliation bill and the rescissions bill. So Congress, at least the first 6-7 months of the Trump administration, has not pushed back in any concerted manner on any step he has taken. But they also don't do a lot on their own in terms of legislation that they're sending to the president. And so he, like many modern presidents, has taken to governing by EO, or executive order. And one of the benefits of executive order for the president is he can do them unilaterally, as long as they're upheld in the courts. But of course, a downside is that the next president who comes in can fairly easily overturn them as well. And so this is where we are. If you look at this latest EO, and he's, I think, issued more EOs in the first 6 or 7 months than any
Yes.
modern president. But
Yes.
this has been, again, coming for a long time. If you look at this latest EO, is the fact that universities and colleges, they have to contend with, they can certainly fight these EOs in court if they have standing. Then they live with them if they don't. And then they get a new president potentially who may come in. Maybe it will be somebody who supports it, but if not, who may overturn it. And they're forced to reassess where they are. All of which is to say, planning becomes incredibly difficult in terms of how to combat this. And so I think that's something that you look at when you talk about sort of mitigating some of this, that becomes deeply troubling. And it is a whole new world, as you mentioned, for college sports. Everybody, as of August 1st, which is now, 5 days ago, for everybody involved, from the athletes, these young people who are the most important part of what we do, to the coaches and everybody in administration, the fans and the alum. And I don't think we have a good sense yet as to how this is going to pan out, how this is going to work out. But I would just tell you, and I have a bias here, that um, I am deeply empathetic to the position that the athletes find themselves in, especially these D1 athletes. And I also, so I think, when you take it from a 30,000-foot level, the primary goal should be to ensure that these young people have the tools that they need when they choose to leave, to have a healthy and fulfilling life as they move on. And that is a concern to me as we look at how these changes have been rolled out. But I think we're very much in the context of college and university sports in that kind of no man's land. We don't really know how this is going to play out. And by the time we know, Donald Trump may be entering his 3rd or 4th year in office, and we may be looking at some changes in this regard.
Yeah, it's very confusing. I can't imagine. I'm sure presidents have their general counsels on speed dial, but some of this is very political. So, for example, I look at what happened in the UVA a few weeks ago with their president deciding to step down, and he realized he didn't have the support of the board. I think they call them the board of visitors there, because the board was appointed by the Republican governor, and so we have such a confluence of different philosophical belief styles on boards, and presidents need their boards to be aligned with them. Do you have any suggestions of navigating that relationship in this political era?
Yeah, and I think that's a great example, the UVA example of what I'm talking about, risk management, because that, of course, was driven by the governor of Virginia in terms of the replacement of those members, Glenn Youngkin. And it is not a surprise. I mean, this was going on, this was discussed, this was coming down the pike. And, we need to think about how invested are we at the, say, in this case, the state and local level, at monitoring what is going on in our governor's offices as it pertains to everything that can impact us in our legislatures, as it can impact us. And this certainly, when you pack a board, can have this dramatic effect. And so, to me, this is where I see, as empathetic as I am to everybody impacted by this, I'm hard pressed to be anything but also critical that there wasn't a plan in place should this happen. Because again, when it happens, our responses can be there, but it's too late. We've missed the boat. And so I am perfectly empathetic to the fact that we can't be watching and be everywhere. But if you're a university in a state, there's a lot of places you need to look, but your state legislature, your governor, that is a critical place for you to make sure that you have eyes and ears. It's not a great analogy, but I think one analogy I would give you is, I live in New York, and they came out after announcing several years ago that they were Democrats, the liberals, if they took over the legislature, they would pass bail reform. And then they came in and did it. And then we had a lot of people in the policing end of things impacted by this who cried foul. But for risk mitigation, that could not have been and should not have been a surprise to them. They should have been prepared. And did they invest in campaigning against it? Did they invest in lobbying? Did they, was there any campaign? So I think the same thing applies when you're talking about what's happening in these boards.
Yeah.
So I do think what I'm hoping is that this is a wake-up call at institutions, that they see the importance of political risk mitigation, which organizations have tended not to do so well in the past, but is critically important, and they need to invest in it for their livelihoods. And what's happening in the last 6 and 7 months is, another reminder. I think the first one was COVID, and this is another reminder.
Yeah. What do you what would that look like if they wanted to start investing now? Would it be hiring more lobbyists? Would it be trying to get more folks in the state legislatures to understand by regular meetings with the president, with the vice presidents, that type of thing? What would that look like?
So what it would look like depends on the institution. And this is why the first thing is to do a risk analysis and a political risk analysis, and to determine your vulnerabilities, to determine your greatest assets, your greatest vulnerabilities, and to make a determination with the people who know and love your institution best, right? The president, the board, the faculty, the students, the alum. Where should we focus our attention? And knowing we all have limited resources, and then decide. And it may be, if you are a, say, public institution vulnerable to a gubernatorial appointed board, that it makes sense to hire lobbyists or something like that. That's not going to be true for all. So there's not one size fits all risk strategies, but political risk is something we can't afford to ignore, I think, is the lesson here. Because when we ignore it, it's too late when something like this hits. So I think that's what I would say would be to invest in, at first, a political risk assessment. Where are we vulnerable? And, and political risk assessment is a lot of I'm a political scientist, so we do a lot of role playing and game playing, and it's part and parcel of that, where you say, what can happen and what is likely to happen, what would be the most detrimental to us, and then where should we focus our resources? Gosh forbid it does happen. So I think that would be the number one point for these colleges and universities, a lot of whom have people who do this work on campus.
Yeah.
Um,
Right.
so
Right.
using
They
the
have resources.
to do some of this really important
Yeah.
work. And it's not just colleges and universities, it's all organizations. But organizations that survive long term and thrive do this very, very well. And ones who don't perish because they can't survive, these black swan events, then they aren't prepared to meet the moment when we are befallen by these crises.
Yeah, it's a great point. I hadn't really thought about it in that way, but I think you're right. You've got to have a contingency plan because we've had two black swan events in the last 5, 6 years. So it's been
Exactly.
crazy. I want to bring it back to college sports because I want my listeners to understand many schools will not be able to afford to revenue share with their athletes because where does the money come from for the athletics department? Student tuition and student fees. I don't know if that's what Iona is experiencing right now, but I know they've had a very successful men's basketball program over the years. So, how do you think schools that have to choose where to divvy up their money, if they have to decide we can't afford it, we can't afford to do this revenue share, and we can't be as competitive, how do they politically manage that decision with their alumni, with their students, with others who care about the team, etc.?
Yeah, I am so frightened about this very idea, because I think that this is what so many institutions, and unfortunately, it'll likely be the institutions without huge endowments, that have the worst of this. Uh, they're going to have to make some really, really tough decisions. And the likely decisions are going to be we've got to cut somewhere. And I will tell you, just speaking about, and I'm not involved in athletics at per se at Iona, but many years ago, Iona well, I lived through an Iona decision to no longer have our football team. And
Yeah, right.
I mention that only because that was, an incredibly devastating blow to those young people who had come to the university to study and to play, to be told all of a sudden, and I think the university handled it very well. But of course, it's incredibly, incredibly distressing to these young athletes,
Absolutely.
and to the coaches and to the staffs and to the parents. So, having lived through that, this is one of the things that I'm really frightened about is if and when these cuts come, and I unfortunately think they will, what does that do to these young student athletes? And this is what I mean. Our goal should be, first and foremost, what are we doing? We are trying to enrich their lives, and enrich the lives that they have going forward in the community. And when we have these revenue sharing and these other decisions that are made, um, what does that do? And I also, again, fear that the hits will come on the smaller tuition based universities and colleges who can least afford it. And that's distressing as well. So, I know that this is already happening, but one sort of rule about risk mitigation is to make sure that you are part of a collective that is working together, people who are similarly situated with similar concerns, so that you can discuss options. You can maybe share in some of the pain and some of the glory, right? It's the old idea of a union or some kind of group. And I think we have a lot of those in higher ed, but I think in this particular case, we have a lot of those in athletics. I think we're going to see the universities and the athletic departments turn to each other across college and university campuses as how can we address this? And I just raised one example. If college A has to cut X program, can we have some kind of consortium where the poor impacted athletes and coaches and staff can maybe benefit by going to this other institution that still has a program and vice versa? So, there's, I think, ways to mitigate some of the pain. But that's, again, just dealing with the crisis at the moment. It's not planning for what's to come, which is part of the mitigation strategy. So I often talk about like upstreaming. We can't only be like, making sure we're keeping the balls in the air by addressing the pain of the students at the institution and the faculty and the staff and everything. We've also got to be planning for the future. So I think we're going to have to run on two tracks, unfortunately, to deal with the problem at the moment, and then the long-term planning to protect our future athletes and everything else that's coming down the pike.
I think that's the role of the athletic conference, right? Because you join, hopefully, peers, like minded, values are consistent. You join an athletic conference for those reasons. And what I'm seeing is this first year, they can make decisions next year about opting in or opting out. But most college conferences are in alignment and they're all deciding, okay, we're all going to do this. But we have to also realize that there'll be institutions that over the year realize it's too much. So, what can we do to help our colleagues, if we still want them to be in the conference, mitigate, as you said, or try to navigate this next iteration? Should it be they have to change and leave the conference? That could be hard for travel, for academic competitiveness, athletic competitiveness. So, I think what you're saying, that structure actually exists, but can we show each other that grace in the middle of all this?
Exactly. And that's one of the things, like when you think about handling risk, is where do you have quote unquote friends and allies? Because none of us can address every crisis by ourselves. And so, absolutely, the conferences are a perfect structural, important institution by which that pain, I hate to use that word, can be shared. And, one of the things I would also love to see, and I know the conferences are as strapped as all of us, but um, can they do anything to show grace to the institutions that aren't part of the conference for whatever reason? Can they, is there anything they could do, even by way of talking and communication? Because you do have universities that are out of conferences. And what can we do to support them? So, it's like the lifting all boats kind of
Yeah.
idea. And you're absolutely right, though, that the structure is going to be critically important, maybe more important. And I'm no expert, obviously, in college athletics, but maybe more important than we've seen it in the past going forward. And so, that's incredibly important for everybody impacted by this. And again, what's to come in the future.
Yeah, I could not agree more. One of the great models of lifting all boats is in the Big Ten because they have an academic alliance as well as an athletic alliance. And so they share research, they partner with each other. Wouldn't you love to see more of that in athletics as well?
Absolutely. And I love that example. That's a great example. And, you know, that should be a model for all these and, for all the conferences. And of course, it's so important because there's a lot of goodwill towards athletics already. So there's no shortage of that. But it also engenders a lot more goodwill amongst every member of the community when there's that kind of interplay amongst the athletics and the research, so it just, there's no downside, in other words, to something like that, resource depending, if it can be pulled together. So it's a great example.
Jeanne, I can't thank you enough. It's a pleasure to get to know you as a professor, as someone who believes, fully in this American experience and what we can be. Thank you for taking the time today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Karen. I am delighted to talk to you, and please keep doing what you're doing, because these kinds of conversations that you're leading are, I think, one thing that we can all do to share with the rest of our communities and the rest of the world the work that's going on and the challenges and the bright spots. And, I have to tell you very quickly, I have just connected recently with the president of my alma mater at UConn, a first female president of UConn, Dr. Susan Herbst, who's lovely. And being able to reconnect with her, I spend my life at colleges and universities, but it just reminds me how important and formative those years I spent in stores were, and they've shaped my entire life. And so many millions of us have that experience. And that's why I think what you're doing is so important, because, we get busy with our lives, so we don't think about it. But when people think about the importance of that, and they're reminded in spaces like yours, it's an incredibly important thing for us to do for our universities and colleges, because we need to have these conversations. So thank you very much.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Good.